And speaking of insurance, today's opening session is sponsored by Intact Insurance, represented here today by Jason Thistlethwaite. I had to say that 5 times before I came up here, who will introduce our speaker panel and moderate this session. Jason is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, where he specializes in climate change risk. Jason is also the director of the Climate Change Adoption Project Canada at the University of Waterloo. He holds a PhD in global governance from the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and his research focuses on innovative strategies to reduce vulnerability to climate change risks. To inform this research, Jason works directly with business and government leaders in the insurance, banking, real estate, building, and investment industries. His research has been published in a number of academic and industrial journals. He is also a frequent speaker and media contributor on Canada's growing vulnerability to the extreme weather and a self-described weather geek. Jason, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and excited about this morning's panel on climate reality for cities and infrastructure. I'd first like to thank Intact for supporting the panel. I've worked with Intact for a number of years now around issues on climate change adaptation and urban resiliency. And for them, this is, a very existential and serious business issue, which they take very seriously, as we've all seen extreme weather events across the country increase in their frequency, intensity, and cost. So with that said, our first panel today is going to discuss, set the context of resilience, and take a look at a couple key points. The science behind the changes in urban climates, what to expect in the coming years as extreme events become more frequent, how we need to rethink, plan, and design buildings and cities for resilience, and extreme climate events and liability in the built environment. With that said, I will introduce a couple of our speakers. So first up, we have James Voogt. He's the assistant professor, Department of Geography at Western University. He's an urban climatologist with academic training in physical geography and boundary layer meteorology. His research focuses on the measurement and modeling of surface temperatures in urban environments, and includes studies on the impact of white and green roofs on urban climates. He's the current president of the International Association for Urban Climate and a co-author of the forthcoming text, Urban Climates from Cambridge University Press.
Good morning, thanks for having me. I thought I'd start off with an ad because there seems to be ads, and I realized that you are a great audience to invite to the organization that I represent in part, the International Association for Urban Climate. And this summer in Toulouse, we host a conference called the International Conference on Urban Climate, and it's specifically looking at how cities are going to respond to climate change on a local scale, so incorporating the urban part of climate as well as the large-scale climate. So some of my colleagues in France, and I'll mention them in my talk here, have done quite a bit of work on that. And I think this is a community we'd love to see come out to that kind of conference. So we want to get people that work at the building scale and the planning scales, as well as with those of us who look at the science of the climate from both larger and urban scales. So please come out, and if you search us on Google, you'll find a link to that conference. This year we passed the 400 parts per million mark in carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, and that sets the context for climate change. And I think I have quite a few slides I think that will help illustrate the points that Gord made earlier. And so this is a measured indication of how the climate is changing. So our concentrations are going up, and they're going up at an increasing rate. If we look even further forward, and this is quite festive with all its colors, the most recent IPCC reports are looking at where we might go in the future, and they've shifted from scenarios to something they call representative concentration pathways. And the particular concern about representative concentration pathways are that on the track we're on, we have been towards the top end of these representative concentration pathways. And those top ends, the ones that are labeled RCP 8.5 here, represent situations in which we are basically not doing anything about climate change. So we're going towards that top end. And if we want to achieve our 2-degree target, which is the target that scientists have set that represents where we think we have manageable climate change, we need to follow a pathway that's closer to that RCP 2.6. So that's the spectrum we have. The RCP 2.6, the colored, you sort of see the blue line towards the bottom there. Increasingly, the emissions we have don't coincide with the pathways the models think we need to be on to get there. So it means that timeliness is becoming an essence here. The emissions we put into the atmosphere turn into concentrations, and those concentrations force radiative heating of the system, and that leads to climate change. The thing we have the most confidence in is temperature. So here's the spectrum of temperature we might expect on a global scale. So when we use these numbers, 2 degrees or 6 degrees, we're talking about an average increase in global temperatures. And so the blue shaded lines there represent what change we might expect from that RCP 2.6 type scenario, ones that we're not currently on. And the red bounds are the simulations, and the shading just shows the range of all the different simulations that are used by the IPCC, the modeling groups that report. So there's variation in there, but the track, that is the track we are currently on based on our current emissions. So that's where the world's headed in terms of its average temperature. But what does average temperature mean? It doesn't mean a lot to you or me sitting here in a building in Toronto, right? That's a global average temperature. It's what the models are good at, but it's not necessarily what we need to know. If we zoom in a bit, here's what temperatures look like in North America. And the pattern of warming is not equal across the globe. You get more warming in land areas, and you get substantially more the further north you go. So if we say, even if we're on RCP 2.6 track for 2 degrees mean global warming, you're not going to get 2 degrees here, you're going to get more. Canada in particular will get a lot more when you go further north. And the IPCC has very high confidence in temperature in particular. It's easier for the models to handle. Zoom down yet another scale. What's going to happen in the city? And beyond just looking at average temperatures, what's going to happen to temperatures that start to have impacts on society, on infrastructure, and on people? So these are a couple of graphs, one's from the Ministry of the Environment for Ontario, and another's a more recent update. They're just bar charts, and they're for some Ontario cities that show the frequency of hot days and hot nights, the colored bar on the right, that are going to change in the future. And these become important because, for example, hot nights have been shown from health studies to be quite important for the human body to recover when you're in a heat wave. And if that temperature doesn't drop, then you start to build up health impacts, and there's going to be a load on the health system, and there can be health consequences for people. So these temperature extremes are important to understand, as well as what's changing in the mean. And those become important for infrastructure because they place load on electrical distribution, demand for energy as well. So there's urban infrastructure implications there. And there's an urban implication from the science as well, because what we do in cities is we modify that large-scale climate. We've changed our environment, and we add a burden as well. Gordon mentioned that the climate has already changed, and I'm going to intersperse through this talk several examples that illustrate that. These are some recent results of people who are using current data. This is not models of the future. This is based on looking at data from 1979 to 2011, and looking at heat waves. And they are showing, there's 15 different panels here, and they're different measures of heat waves, but the point is that they are already seeing increases in these events based on existing data. This is one of Canada's tennis players, and there was a special issue of the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, just came out this past week, I think, and they've had different research groups looking at specific extreme events in 2013. And on the side of temperatures and heat waves in particular, there's been quite coincident results from these modeling groups that are able to actually attribute those events in part to anthropogenic climate change. So events we have already seeing now are due in part to climate change. Cities, as I've mentioned, also impact the climate locally, and in many cases they place an additional burden on the climate change we might expect. So the top right panel is a simulation from Environment Canada's high-resolution urban modeling system. It's for Toronto. We're running some tests for the Pan Am Games. There's going to be some simulations that look at both the heat impacts in Toronto and what Toronto does in terms of precipitation, because turns out cities can actually modify precipitation regimes too, and they can add an additional burden to precipitation coming down. So we've added heat, and heat is important because, according to US data, it's actually the leading cause of death when you look at all the different impacts of weather, and there have been several recent major heat wave impacts that have resulted in significant deaths. So heat has become a pretty major issue in terms of cities in particular and climate and what's going to happen with climate change. So, and Gordon mentioned the distribution and thinking about sigmas. The panel in the bottom right here is a study of that European heat wave in 2003. And the top two little panels here, I think if I have it, yes, here and here, show you the distribution of summertime temperatures based on observations and then what their model tells you for the period 1964 to 2002, I think it is. And then here's what it's going to look like in the future. The 2003 heat wave here is your high sigma event that's well outside that normal distribution of temperatures. But if you look in terms of the future, it becomes the new normal. And that's a problem because, of course, it has impacts on people's health. This is a study for Chicago that looked at potential impacts on human health and deaths that might be expected from future heat waves. So those are going to go up in the future as well. What about precipitation? So Toronto's had some notable events. If we look at precipitation, the world's going to become a different place in terms of precipitation, but it's much more difficult for the models to give a clear picture on what's happening. Some places get more rain, some places get less rain. There has been a bit of an adage that the wet get wetter and the dry get drier, but recent work suggests that's quite a bit oversimplified, but there's going to be changes in precipitation. Oops, sorry. If we look on a regional scale, a couple of patterns become evident. One is that precipitation increases tend to go up as we go further north. With a high forcing scenario, you can see there's more blue up here in northern North America. There's parts of North America that will also dry out, but there's less confidence in some of these patterns compared to temperature. But we also see on the left-hand side, the blue indicates from observations, so again, not modeling, observations, that precipitation has already increased in some parts of North America. And of course, you're familiar in the GTA here with events. And again, it's not just total annual precipitation that matters. It can be, what do we get over short periods of time? So specific events. So events like this are thought to be increasing in their frequencies. So the IPCC thinks that it's quite likely that the type of event that gives these flash floods is going up, and the recent US National Climate Assessment shows for our neighbors to the south in kind of the same climate region that we have an increase. And that recent 2014 report that just came out this week also points to the fact that there is increasing evidence that these one-day extreme events are increasing. The GO train needs water wings, I understand. So these are big impacts. Cities have an impact on the weather, so climate is changing. The city's impact on local scale weather can affect precipitation. And of course, the changes we make to the land surface change the hydrologic balance. So where does that water go? So it becomes a big infrastructure problem. It becomes a big risk. So my colleagues in the insurance industry and in the infrastructure industry are concerned about the costs associated here. This is Finch Street. This is an earlier event, again in Toronto, so damage to urban infrastructure. And these events, we're basically going to double the likelihood of these types of events going forward. Not just flash floods, but the character of larger scale floods is likely to change with climate change. And the character of these floods, it's a bit more complicated, but it's going to depend on where do we get precipitation, when do we get it, what is the state of the ground when it's happening. So we're getting more intense rainfalls, but we're changing the distribution of that rainfall in space. The normal spring type floods that we've had, that character might change because we may not have as big a snowpack, we may have more rain distributed through the winter as opposed to snow. So the character of our floods and the timing of them might be different, and that means that our systems in preparation for them may also be different. So the characters of flooding likely to change, and of course the human development, our changes to the water balance system through urban development also have a role to play in this. What about severe weather? So if there's more moisture in the atmosphere, then we have actually more energy for severe weather. There's not a lot of confidence from the IPCC to say, you're going to get more thunderstorms. And certainly one of the factors is that tornadoes are actually, the forcing factors for them is actually slightly weaker according to the IPCC. But at least in terms of thunderstorm, there's more moisture, which serves as fuel for those storms. So potentially more severe weather, at least in terms of those strong downpours that give us flooding implications for cities. Another Toronto example is ice storms. Major damage that came about from the 2013 event, and the pictures on the top row from the Eastern Ontario and Quebec ice storm back in 1998. So substantial damages associated with that. And a recent report on Canada in a changing climate from Environment Canada suggests that the increase in those types of events in Southern Ontario is likely to increase substantially too. And I'd be remiss, and I know Toronto's not coastal on an ocean, but if you're in business and you're interested in infrastructure, then one of the areas of risk for cities are our coastal cities. And this is a table that we were looking at for the textbook that I've been working on, and it looks at the exposed population and the exposed assets in a number of world cities and how it's going to change from the current climate to the future climate. And particularly notable are in some of those developing countries, the really strong multipliers that apply to the exposed assets because of climate change. And that's not just because of the physical change of the climate system, but it's because of the change to the number and to the value of the infrastructure that's exposed to rising sea levels. I stole this diagram from the IPCC. Well, I borrowed it. It's attributed. Why? I liked it because it shows a city. It shows a city, it shows a building that's incorporating technologies that are attempting to make it more resilient, that will help it adapt, that will also contribute to mitigation of climate change. What do cities have to do with climate change? The answer is a whole lot. The majority of greenhouse gas emissions are either driven by urban energy use or by activities that are occurring in cities. And so the top panel there shows, or the bottom panel shows our total emissions in particular cities. And of course, they're not weighted equally by population. Some of us have bigger footprints than others. But cities become important in terms of the conversation about climate change and going forward because we are responsible for so many of these emissions. And so cities are important because we're going to be impacted by climate change, but what we do has a feedback in terms of mitigation. All right, so if we change what we do, how we construct our cities, we have the ability to change those emissions. And of course, we have to adapt to this changing climate. So there's a two-way conversation that has to happen here. Cities and their greenhouse gas emissions, so I'm just going to give you a couple examples at a couple of different scales here. Again, this one's from our textbook that we're working on. On the left, of course, cities in different climates require different amounts of energy for their heating and cooling needs. But how you design your city, how you lay it out, how much space you consume also provides a strong signal of greenhouse gas emissions. So here's Toronto. So the way we deal with urban areas and how we think about the future of what they're going to look like becomes important. And I know that transit's a big conversation in Toronto at the moment, and as Gord pointed out, it's a big fraction of emissions, and transit and the layout of your city and how much space it consumes can be important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Cities themselves modify the climate. I'm sure most of you have heard about urban heat islands. It goes beyond that. Cities have the capacity to change just about every element of weather. The fact that cities are warm doesn't warm the globe. That's a different scale effect. But it does change the local climate to the people that are here. And this is a long list of factors that basically govern the physical system of urban climate. That's what I spend my time looking at, and this is Toronto. And I'm intentionally just showing you a couple of different land use types here that underscore the physical characteristics of the system that can change local climates. And the future city that we have has to think about all of these factors and more if you're going to start designing a city for the next century to try to be prepared for climate change from both an adaptation and a mitigation standpoint. I'm sure as an organization you're very well versed with at the building scale, but of course not just the layout of the city, but what actually happens at the individual building scale can be important to climate change too. And I want to finish off just with a couple of slides that illustrate Gord's point about the budget of carbon remaining. So Gordon talked about, we have this, and he talked about it in the context of the carbon that needs to stay in the ground. So there's been a shift in the IPCC's and climate scientists' approach to how we look at climate change by going to a presentation where we look at what is the total carbon being emitted and what is the temperature increase from the pre-industrial level. And they plot all the different RCPs on there, plot in a roughly linear fashion, which is kind of handy. And so if you take the 2-degree temperature increase and you come down, that tells you what your budget is. So that's the budget that Gord had mentioned. And this is a little bit messy, but the disturbing message is we've used up about 2/3 of that budget. And the more disturbing message is, this is something that just came out in Nature Geoscience last week, is that estimates of our emissions are increasing upwards. The economy's doing a bit better. Developing nations aren't being as much energy efficient as we thought they might be. So we are on the wrong track. We need to be down here for 2, and we're above that. So that's a problem. Here's some summary points. Climate change is here. It's going to get worse unless we start doing something about it. And cities are very important to consider in that conversation because of their demand for energy. And what we do going forward in cities will be really important in terms of the climate of the globe as a whole. Thanks.
Thanks so much, James. It's incredible to see the impact that cities can have on something as big as the scale as climate change. So with that, our next speaker is Glenn McGillivray. He's the Managing Director of the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction. I've known Glenn for a few years now, and he puts on a great presentation. Prior to joining the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, Glenn served as Assistant Vice President of Corporate Communications for Swiss Re Insurance Company Canada, and was Corporate Secretary for 3 Swiss Re operations in the country. He began his insurance career at Toronto-based The Personal Insurance Company of Canada, and went on to work for a major Canadian corporate law firm before joining Swiss Re in 1994 and ICLR in November 2005. So with that, here's Glenn.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm with ICLR. We're located just down the street. And I think my job this morning is to scare the heck out of you. And if I've managed to do that after 20 minutes or so, my job is done. I'm going to start by showing you some catastrophe loss data. This is data from Swiss Re Insurance Company. I worked for Swiss Re for over 11 years, and they do a really good job at gathering catastrophe data worldwide, primarily because they're the guys that pay the bill after these events. Usually reinsurers will pick up about 2/3 of the bill after a cat event if it's big enough. And so what we see here is catastrophe data from the period 1970 to the end of last year, and we see a really big ramp up in the number of catastrophe events from about the mid-80s period onward. Okay, this is number of events that meet a certain criteria. There's some earthquake in there, but for the most part we're talking about hydrometeorological events, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. So if you have a graph like this, a trend line like this, you're going to get a trend line like this, and this is cost of those events. And again, you see a little bit of statistical noise there, a little bit of spiking, but again, mid-80s period onward, huge leap in cat losses. These are normalized for inflation. The first big spike there you see in 2005, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, of course, $106 billion in insured losses. And then just a few years later, Hurricane Sandy and a few other things give you that second spike. Even when you take those spikes away, there's a very clear upward trend in the cost of natural catastrophe events worldwide. Now, Swiss Re has a major competitor. That's Munich Reinsurance Company. Munich also does a very, very good job at gathering cat data. Pretty much the same numbers, but what Munich Re has done here is they've broken it down by peril. And what you see in the red there is earthquake-related events, earthquake, seismic-related stuff. And there's not really a lot of spikiness in earthquakes. They pretty much stable year after year. It's just where earthquakes happen that grab our attention. Where we see the growth and the real issue and problem is with climate-related events, hydrometeorological events, events involving wind and or rain, and typically North Atlantic hurricane, typhoon, cyclone, that sort of thing. So again, a very clear uptick in the number of those events worldwide. When I take this data, put it in a bar chart, break it down decadally, we see a 20-fold increase in cat losses from about the 60s period to present. If we go back a little bit more, we're looking at a 30 to 40-fold increase in the number of these events. This used to be, I think, a not Canadian problem. We've become very complacent in Canada because although we have our share of events, we don't get those really big ones, or at least we didn't. But we see a very clear uptick in the number of hydrometeorological events worldwide. Again, the rusty orange bar at the bottom is seismic-related events. Again, they stay stable year after year. We get about 5,000 earthquakes in Canada every year. There's no spikiness. But what we see is a very dramatic increase in the number of hydrometeorological events in Canada. And again, as mentioned by Gord, this is translated into water being the #1 driver of homeowner insurance claims in Canada, surpassing fire just a few short years ago. The Canadian government, through Emergency Preparedness Canada, has a Canadian disaster database. There's about 800 events in that database now, going back to the year 1900. That was most recently updated. Before that update, there were 600 events in the database, and we see a clear 40% of those events were flood events. So flood is the most common peril in Canada. It is the most common peril worldwide. And then we get a dog's breakfast of everything else in Canada. Prior to 2009, we had 2 instances of where insurers in Canada had to pay $1 billion a year because of cat losses. But those were kind of deemed as statistical outliers, very rare. Our industry didn't get too concerned about it. But in 2009, we had $1 billion loss year for Canadian property casualty insurance companies. And what generally happens in Canada is you get a big event that takes up the lion's share, and then you get a smattering of other sized events, and when you add them up, in this case, you got $1 billion. And the big event that year was back-to-back windstorms in Alberta and Calgary area, and that cost Canadian insurers and reinsurers about $500 million, and a few other things, including 19 tornadoes in one day in Ontario, an all-time record. You add it all up, you get $1 billion. So I can tell you that our industry, the property casualty industry, who our members are P&C insurers, they weren't too concerned about this. They're sitting on about $40 billion in capital. They pay the claims, they weren't too concerned. But then 2010 rolled around, and guess what? We had another $1 billion plus year for Canadian insurers. First time ever that we had back-to-back $1 billion years. And people talked a little bit, I can tell you. Go to a lot of, the insurance industry is very social in Canada. There are a lot of events, and people are talking about it. Hey, it's pretty interesting, never happened before, but they weren't too concerned. The big event that year was a hailstorm in Alberta. Get used to it. Lots of these hailstorms happening all the time. That was about a $400 to $500 million storm. A few other things in there, you add it all up, you have $1 billion. Okay, fine, fair enough. 2011 rolls around, guess what, folks? Not $1 billion year for Canadian property casualty insurers, but a $1.7 billion year. So, first time ever for $3 billion plus years in a row. I can tell you my industry is starting to really pay attention now. We're getting grabbed aside at social events, we're getting emails, we're getting phone calls. What's happening? What's going on? The big event that year was a wildfire in Slave Lake, Alberta, $700 million insured damage. Slave Lake is a town of 13,000 people. A third of that town burned, $700 million insured loss, okay? Our industry was a little taken by that. You take that event out of the mix, you still got $1 billion. So you got $3 billion plus years in a row. And as I said, the industry is really starting to pay attention now, but it's not over. 2012 rolls around, $1.2 billion year. The big one there, another hailstorm out west, I believe. That was a big one. Largest, most expensive hailstorm in Canadian history, $700 million, a few other things there. And I believe the total for that year was $1.2 billion insured loss. 4 years in a row. And we're really being asked to comment on this. What is happening? And we actually put out an official release on that, and I'll show it to you, a quote from that in a minute. But guess what? It's not over. Remember last year, guys? Flooding in southern Alberta, $1.8 billion. 3 weeks later, flooding in Toronto, $1 billion. Last week of the year, ice storm in the GTA, $225 million. Add those three things up, a few other things, not $1 billion year, not a $1.7 billion year, a $3.2 billion year for Canadian property casualty insurers. Add those years up, I believe it comes in at $7.7 billion, okay? These are events of $25 million or higher. They do not include smaller events. Seeing an awful lot of the small events this year, the $5 and $10 million events, the $15 million events. Nor does it include the little isolated things. So when you add those things up, they cost insurers about $1 billion a year, so you add another $1 billion per year for those just run-of-the-mill things, you know. What's going on? Actually, this year, well, let me tell you a little bit about last year. We hit many, many records last year, okay? So first of all, we had Canada's costliest and third costliest events ever in just the span of 3 weeks. Don't forget, the property casualty insurance industry is not only dealing with the floods in southern Alberta, they're not only dealing with the floods in Toronto, they're also dealing with Lac Mégantic at the same time. We don't do man-made disasters at ICLR, we do natural catastrophes, but our industry was really tapped last year with these three things going on. The ice storm was the number one, the 98 ice storm was the number one loss in Canada for 15 years. It fell to second place. The second place event, the Slave Lake wildfire, fell 2 notches to fourth place. It was, last year was the first time ever we had $2 billion plus loss years in the same events in the same year. And again, as I mentioned to you, fifth consecutive year of $1 billion plus events. And we've seen a few of these already. A friend of mine from Carstairs, Alberta said to me, they called it High River for a reason. He's allowed to say that. As an Ontarian, I'm not, but he's, you know, they called it High River for a reason. And yet we built on the floodplain, or they built on the floodplain there. And you know, it's not just the water, it's the mud, the silt, getting into critical infrastructure in the downtown core. $1 billion of the losses were from commercial loss. The Saddle Dome claim alone was well over $100 million. $1.7 billion. Doesn't include the cost of adjusting claims. You add another 6% on top of that. 3 weeks later. Interesting thing about this, and I always get a nervous laugh, is that here's a very critical GO train route, very critical rail route, next to the Don Valley Parkway, both of those things on a floodplain, in a river valley on a floodplain. They flood a couple times a year, and the powers that be feign surprise. Oh my gosh, it flooded again. We put these things on floodplains, and then we get surprised when they flood. I also get nervous laughter here. Who's going to rescue the rescuers, right? Don Valley Parkway, there we go. When you add those claims adjustment expenses I talked to you about, you're looking at $1 billion loss. But it wasn't over. Last week of the year. And I keep telling this, especially to insurance crowds, the year is not over till it's over, okay? Until the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, you can hoist the glass and say, phew, we made it through the year. This was the last week of the year, and we had a $225 million loss. Add those three things up and a few other things, we had a $3.2 billion year last year. This year, they're calling it a quiet year. We're at $652 million insured right now. I read an article yesterday that said it's a reprieve year for Canadian insurers. The year's not over yet, as I just said, okay? I will say it's a reprieve year if we make it through to the end and nothing happens. But again, $652 million is nothing to sneeze at either, folks, right? I took this picture of all my years of working on natural catastrophes. This is the first one that I was in the middle of. And that's a it's actually, I'm sorry, this is a wrong number. It's a $90 million insured loss so far, but the claims are still coming in. 2,313 homeowners reported flooding to the city of Burlington. Our work shows that probably twice that number call their insurance company, don't call the city. So there's a pretty good chance we have about 5,000 homes damaged in Burlington. As noted in Jamie's slide, 2 months of rain in just a few hours. Oh, I did have the slide, okay. What's going on this year? Angus tornado. Okay, we're at about $30 million for that event. An EF2 tornado ripping through, damaging 102 homes in Essa Township. Some flooding and thunderstorms out west, and the Burlington event, and Alberta wind and thunderstorms. That's a big hailer. That's the big event for this year so far, $450 million insured and growing. So we're at $652 million so far this year. So we've had billion-dollar loss years in the past, okay? We had one in 1998, completely and only because of the ice storm. And then we had another billion-dollar loss year in 2005, largely due to the August 19th rainstorm in Toronto that washed out Finch Avenue. Our industry kind of viewed those years as outliers. They weren't too concerned about them. But then, as I just showed you, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. Boom, 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 boom. What's going on? Well, there are a number of reasons why we have severe weather events. There are a number of reasons why they affect us in negative ways. We like to point to three main drivers at ICLR. The first is what we call in insurance concentration of values. Lots of stuff jammed into very tight areas, urban areas. The state of our infrastructure and climate change. Those are the three main drivers. And it's very wrong in my mind to run around and say it's climate change, it's climate change, it's climate change. It's equally as wrong to say it's infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. It's a bunch of things. It's complex, but certainly these are some very significant drivers. So after 2012, we put out a release at ICLR to the insurance press saying this is the new normal. Billion-dollar-plus losses that used to be rare are no longer rare, and we're going to see them more often. We were not going to see them every year. And indeed, we might see a $1.7 or a $3.2 billion year, but we might only see a $500 million year. But the fact of the matter is, these events are no longer rarities. On top of the property damage, we have some concerns about liability issues. And some of the things here, corporate and professional liability ramping up, okay? Directors and officers. There's a discussion out there right now If you're a director of a company that denies climate change, can you be held to account for that? That's a bit of a discussion going on right now. Errors and omissions. Can you sue an engineer for not, or an architect or somebody like that for not incorporating climate change into their figures, into their calculations? Big discussion going on. And actually we're talking about, can we drive change by doing that? By actually taking people to task, pulling them in the court, and saying, you did not factor climate change into the design of this road, this culvert, this bridge, whatever it happens to be. On the public side, the government side, municipalities, you'll see them continue to be sued for things like basement flooding. It's not as easy as it sounds, especially in Ontario, but we are seeing increases in these sorts of things. There's a community group, a homeowners group brewing in Burlington right now that's looking at these types of things right now. They are angry, and they want somebody to be held to task for it. What can be done about this whole ugly mess? We point to two main things: loss prevention and then risk transfer. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that if there's insurance in place and insurance claims money flows quickly, recovery comes much faster. We could take loss prevention, break it further down into three areas. So there's the things that we can build. There's the more ideational things like public policy matters, land use planning and that sort of thing. And getting the public on side, especially with things like basement flooding. I can tell you, homeowners do not blame the government if their home is damaged by wind, and they do not blame the government if their home is damaged by an earthquake. Sometimes they accuse the government of not fighting a wildfire very well, but that's pretty rare in Canada. They do, however, blame the government when their basement floods. Every time. Regardless of the fault, of the cause of it, they blame their municipal government every time. And we have to get homeowners on board to realize that, hey, you know what, this is your home, it's nobody else's home. You're responsible for it, and you have to put mitigation into place. Things that we can build, okay, the floodway in Manitoba. Duff, the premier, got kicked out of office because he wanted to spend $60 million on this piece of infrastructure that has saved about $3 billion for Manitoba and Canadians. You may oversee these things, overlook these things on a daily basis, but we see umpteen examples of how we manage stormwater. Swales, top left there, and other things that we use, we see them every day. These are very commonly in use since about the early 70s. Prior to the 70s, we only used sewers to manage stormwater. Now we use sewers and the surface of the earth. The poster child for the 2005 storm in Toronto was the Finch Avenue washout. If we talk about that event, almost everybody thinks of that big hole in the road. But when that culvert was replaced, the City of Toronto factored climate change into that culvert. They looked at the rainfall that we're going to get, not 10 years from now, but going out much farther than that. The other thing they factored into this culvert was overtopping. So what happened to that roadway, and what happens to roadways in general during rainfall events, is that rainwater rushes down the stream, it's bringing branches, debris with it, blocks the culvert, the water has no place to go, water rises, it eventually overtops and washes out the roadway. Well, this new culvert at Finch and Black Creek has overtopping incorporated into it. These are the types of things we have to think about. Rainwater storage holding tanks. This is in Ottawa. Construction at the left there, completed project on the bottom right there. It's under a grassy park. Nobody knows it's there if you weren't there to witness it. It holds rainwater after a rainfall event and allows the storm sewer system to catch up. In a more drier period, then they can release the water slower. Another benefit is they're not just dumping this water out into creeks and lakes, polluting after a storm. Ottawa uses these, Hamilton uses these, Toronto uses these, places all over use these storage facilities. The Dutch are brilliant at managing water and stormwater, and this is what we call a water plaza. I can picture these downtown Toronto between office towers, right? You sit there at lunchtime in the bleachers and watch a basketball game or whatever, but during an extreme rainfall event, that fills with water, and again allows the sewer system to catch up. Brilliant. A subway station in Thailand, top left there. Before you go down to the subway, you have to walk up a few stairs. The bottom right there is the New York subway system. There's a raised grate there, air intake grate. There's a bench. It's very Frank Gehry-esque. But what happens, when you walk down Yonge Street and University Avenue in Toronto, you see two things. You see air intake vents from the subways flush to the sidewalk, and you see stairs to the subway flush to the sidewalk. Guess what happens when it rains heavily? The subway floods. And we saw subway flooding earlier this week, actually. The Bloor-Danforth line in disarray. And the new roof of the train shed at Union Station is going to be a green roof. And what do green roofs do? They help us manage rainfall a little bit better. They also help mitigate, the urban heat island effect. So very interesting stuff. And rain gardens. Credit Valley Conservation is just one group that's leading in the area of rain gardens, and we have projects going on in places like the Lakeview neighborhood of South Mississauga around Port Credit. And these beautiful rain gardens can hold an awful lot of stormwater. And they have flow monitors in the local sewers, and they can tell that after heavy rainfall events, there's far less water going into the sewer system now than before these rain gardens were made or put in. Green alleys as well, okay? Similar in idea to a rain garden. Underneath, collecting a whole lot of rainwater, preventing it from going into the storm sewer system and overwhelming it. Also preventing it from leaching into the sanitary sewer system and causing sewer backup in the homes. Then there's the risk transfer side of things. And we have the private reinsurance and insurance sector. As I mentioned, they're sitting right now on about $46 billion in capital, a very robust, very strong industry in Canada. And globally, the reinsurance industry has access to about $570 billion in capital right now. So we need to lean on these guys a little bit more, come up with some innovative products that reinsurers can help with. Maybe we can help our government get out of the disaster financial assistance business and lay it onto the private reinsurance sector. Lots of different things we can do. Public-private partnerships, great way for transferring risk. Leaning on the capital markets. There are things right now like catastrophe bonds. There are things that we have right now called green bonds. There's whole ways that we can lean on the capital markets to get things done. And I believe I read that the Toronto Transit Commission is going to issue a green bond in order to expand their system. There is a huge gap, unfortunately, right now worldwide between insured losses and economic losses. So the blue line represents insured losses after catastrophe events. The red line includes the blue line, but also includes the non-insured items. And very often, unfortunately, governments have to pick up the tab. That means you and I pick up the tab, particularly after flood events in Canada. Companies like Swiss Re and Munich Re are advocating that we do things to narrow that gap, get more insurance out there. And one of the ways we can do it is with non-traditional products that lean on the capital markets, like catastrophe bonds. But there are also other things that we can do to narrow the gap between insured losses and economic losses. Risk transfer. I have to remember what I meant here when I put this in here. I think Gord kind of mentioned it at the beginning that there are a lot of possibly negative implications we could have when the insurance industry is in crisis. We're very lucky that our industry is robust in Canada right now. They have about $46 billion in capital. Competition is unbelievable. Average Canadian does not realize just how much competition there is in the insurance industry. Last I counted, there were 90 some odd companies offering homeowner insurance in Ontario. Do you have 90 some odd choices of airline, of railway, of banks, of life insurance companies, of baby food manufacturers? You do not have that choice in anything else. You can go to 90 some odd companies in Ontario and get a homeowner quote. People don't realize that. But we can't always rest on that laurel. There can be a problem. And as Gordon mentioned, there are places that are becoming uninsurable, particularly on the basement flooding side. So if we don't nip this problem in the bud, we're going to have that uninsured line going up, not going down. We have to do something about it before we go into crisis right now. And, rising insurance costs not only affect the homeowner, they affect businesses, they affect government as well. And government, very often, as the last resort, can be left holding the bag. We could have availability problems. Fortunately, we don't have that problem right yet, but there are some people that can't get basement flood insurance because of nagging problems that they're having with basement flooding. Okay. I think when the current federal government says that we have a problem with severe weather, then we have a problem. And this comes out of the Public Safety Canada 2013-2014 report on plans and priorities. So really, if they're raising the alarm bell, be really, really worried. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Up next, our third presentation, we have Alec Hay, from the Associate Director at the University of Toronto Centre for Resilience of Critical Infrastructure. Alec served 25 years in the British Royal Engineers, specializing in fortifications and infrastructure development, practicing variously in North and Central America, Arctic and Antarctica, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. He's operated as a consultant, contractor, and client from the regional to the local level. An independent consultant, Alec is an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, where he teaches strategic infrastructure planning and conducts research into resilience of cities and isolated communities. His current research focus is how to optimize the value return on investment through integrated sustainability, resilience, and protection. He is the International Secretary of the Register of Security Engineers and Specialists. With that, we have Alec.
Thank you very much. When we talk about a resilient city, really we need to be very clear about what we are trying to achieve. And I would suggest to you that a resilient city is one that can not only survive the event, but will recover as rapidly as possible thereafter. After all, we want our economy to be sustainable. We want to have a sustainable development of our economy. And if we can't recover rapidly, we're not going to achieve that. Now, the very nature of not only cities, but the mechanism of cities and how they become resilient is itself hugely complex. Everything you adjust in a city changes the context, it changes the nature of the problem. And it is therefore genuinely complex. It is persistent and flexible. So the approach that we've been taking at the CRCI is to understand those dynamics. We want to understand how does this change in extreme weather events affect us? How does it affect the way that we operate, how we survive, and how we will recover? You know this. Glenn brought up one aspect, though, which was the concentration of value. And this is very much changing the parameters that we need to plan with. But also the other aspect that's changing is our take-up of vulnerabilities. Technology is accelerating so quickly that our take-up of technology is now exceeding the pace at which we can understand the vulnerabilities that that technology brings. And so consequently, we are layering vulnerabilities over vulnerabilities that we no longer have sight of. We do not fully grasp. And these are causing wider problems. So if we are going to look at this problem, it is not just the question of managing that change. It is a question of actually understanding how the event is going to affect us through time. Let's look at the classic incident sequence. We're trotting along, happy as Larry, at a routine level of performance. The incident happens, and our performance, our relative performance, drops to virtually zero. We have a period of reaction, and this period of reaction is completely independent of what has happened. It is our survival instinct, our response, or rather our reaction to the event itself. And it may be the immediate backup of data or something like that. We'll then go into a phase of response. And this response is specific to the situation. Now, you can't respond to a situation until you have reached a minimum survivable level. a minimum operating level of performance. This minimum operating level of performance are the essential functions that enable your future recovery. They're the essential functions that keep you alive. So that has to be where your reaction goes, and your response goes on from there. Now, your response finishes when you have stabilized. And in operational terms, that stabilization point is the minimum sustainable level of operation, of performance. We're not making money, but we can sustain this. We can survive. We can carry on. And from there, we can build our recovery. And the recovery is a predefined sequence. Now, the planning point is that market tolerance, and you can define the market however you wish, but that market tolerance of us not being able to function. Now, if we take that time, 12 years ago, the tolerance of businesses not functioning at normal performance was around about 2 weeks. With the Twin Towers bombing in New York on the 11th of September, it was accepted that people were not really functioning for around about 2 weeks. Even the Wall Street stock exchange was closed down for a period, and it was generally accepted. By the time Calgary flooded last year, that tolerance was down to about 2 or 3 days. If you are not in business, I'm going to take my business elsewhere because I'm not interested in your problems. My problems are my survival. And a part of this is due to the economic downturn, the margins and tolerances have reduced. But that threshold has reduced dramatically. If you're in a supply industry and just-in-time delivery, that tolerance might just be 2 hours. So, for example, in South Germany, with the flooding that was happening last year, if you are a spark plug manufacturer, your tolerance, or your market tolerance, is 2 hours. The fact that your factory is under 5 meters of water really doesn't matter to Mercedes. I will go and buy my spark plugs from someone else. And you have just lost $5 billion worth of contract. Tolerance matters. That is the planning point. That is the point at which you start your recovery. Now, generally speaking, we're finding that the market tolerance and where people are aiming for, people who actually are concerned about resilience, they're aiming to be starting their recovery at 8 a.m. the following business day. So in the worst situation, that means that your reaction and response happen within an 8-hour window. So what? Well, first of all, we have to understand how we are affected by an event. Now, here's an illustration of the flooding in downtown Calgary last year. The dark red is the floodplain. The pinkish color is the surface flooding that was associated with that, with the levees being topped. And then the sort of grayish pink is the power outage associated with that surface flooding. This is repeated for potable water, fire hydrants, transit, things like that. So even if you don't have your socks wet, you are still affected by this event. And this event can put you out of business. So standing there and saying, I'm not in the floodplain, I wasn't affected by the surface flooding, but none of my people have come to work. I had no water, power, or sewerage. I can't sustain this. And 4 days later, you're out of business. And that is happening. Understanding how you are affected by an event is critical. But unfortunately, I don't think many people do. Now, if we look at what drives us, we're talking about sustainable economic development. As the UN ISDR quite clearly pointed out, that requires resilience. With resilience, you have confidence. Your population have confidence, you have confidence. And that confidence attracts the best people that then stimulates your own sustainable economic development. So therefore, it's actually quite a sensible social investment. There's also the other aspect to this. If you have a resilience construct, it allows you to manage your incidents better, and that prevents depopulation. The biggest concern for San Francisco, which essentially the municipality of San Francisco is actually really rather small. All those tech industries, if there's a Cascadia fault earthquake, and the tsunami that's related to that and so on, all those tech industries, if it's not handled well, they'll just leave. What is San Francisco left with? So really, the carrot in all of this is sustainable economic development. The stick is depopulation. And we need to be very clear about what our drivers are when we pursue this. Now let's put that into a wider context, because fundamentally we're talking about understanding. So if we look at a city, the sustainable economic development of that city depends entirely upon infrastructure. It enables the growth of the city. Infrastructure enables civilization. It provides us with sanitation, power, transportation, communication, you name it. But the city is like a parasite. It consumes the very thing that enables it. And it wears down the infrastructure that it depends upon. Now that dynamic fits within a regional picture. And we've referred to it as equilibrium. It's essentially an extension of equilibrium theory. And we said that the fundamental aspect that enables a balance of how we invest in our infrastructure, how we maintain it, and how it then enables our own economic development is our understanding of our relationship with that infrastructure. And the only way that we can really inform that understanding is seeing infrastructure as a common resource, the understanding of it as a common resource which needs to be enabled by somebody outside. Now, I would suggest that that is the province. If the province can explain to municipalities, to organizations, where their relationship is with the infrastructure, it'd be easier for us to get our hands around it. You may be familiar with Eleanor Ostrom,'s work, Nobel laureate. She talked about governing the commons and the idea of a common resource. The common resource in this particular case is that understanding of your relationship with infrastructure, it's knowledge. And if we can manage that, if we can provide that equal access and management of it, we will be able to find the natural equilibrium for each community with the infrastructure. That tells us where we need to invest in adaptation. That tells us where we can apply these climate change strategies to maximum effect and still enable our own sustainable economic development. So why do communities fail? More to the point, why do communities survive? First of all, the infrastructure experiences shocks. That infrastructure, when the lines come down or there's an earthquake and the infrastructure is shocked, it stops. It stops providing its function. An earthquake happens in a city or an ice storm. It doesn't stop the city. The city is stressed by it. And so we see this balance between the infrastructure and the city, where the city is stressed and applies those stresses to the infrastructure. The infrastructure is shocked and stresses the city. Our tolerances and our thresholds for how that is going to affect us comes out of that. But as I said, why do those cities succeed, the ones that do? And there are 5 common features to each community when we looked at dozens of communities against different forms of natural event. Why did they succeed? Why did they survive? Now, Jane Jacobs would be very pleased with us because the first 2 that immediately came to mind were community focus and community identity. This was also a main theme of Peter Hall, who recently died. He was pushing that idea that a community that understands and is aware of itself and understands what it's about is a community that can respond and react. Let's look at that slightly differently. If this is a city, and these are all the various groups within the city, geographically dispersed. At the moment, our way of denoting wards and districts is to just draw convenient lines on the map. But that's not the way communities work. This might be a self-identifying community. For whatever reason, there'll be something that community identifies as common to all of them. There'll be another one, and another one, and another. Now, all of these communities are self-identifying. They already have an inherent trust mechanism, a leadership dynamic, and communication structure inherent to that self-identifying community. We're ticking off the first two critical criteria, characteristics, that we find in communities that survive. So why not make that our administrative district? In times of trouble, your communication will be far more efficient, far more effective, and it will come from trusted mouths. So looking at the other three characteristics, one is this idea of balanced infrastructure. That is infrastructure that meets the needs and growth of the community. It's not infrastructure that's completely out of balance. If you put a multi-lane highway next to a small village, the village will die. Similarly, if you do not upgrade the sewerage in a growing city or a densifying city, it's going to have a limiting point and people just aren't going to populate it. Industry's not going to move there. There needs to be a strategic framework of how communities relate to each other and relate to the administration, to relate to the higher authority. And that goes beyond just political relations. That goes into one community providing standby power to another community. You can reduce this down to a building level. If each building is capable of islanding, but they associate, say, 3 or 4 or 5 buildings together, if one building has a power failure, its standby power system doesn't work, the other 3 can support its essential functions. There are ways that we need to relate that strategic relationship, that strategic framework. And the last one is confidence in leadership. And interestingly, this can be in the total absence of true leadership. If people are confident in leadership, they're more likely to use their own resources, confident or assured that when they reach into the center, they will be looked after and they will be prioritized with other people. So, what have we done with all of this? Well, Dialogue last year produced this rather simple framework. This is a way of stimulating resilience in communities. Using this framework, you can develop policy, you can identify where you want to go, how you wish to invest in development, and therefore, how to apply the very measures that we are talking about, how to address these climate change issues. So, we identify where we want to go, what do we have, fairly generic really. I'll bring the whole thing up, it'll be easier to see. And going through this process, we identify our resilience goals. Because if we know what we want to achieve in terms of sustainable economic development, we then understand what we depend upon, the very things that we rely on to enable our economic development. Therefore, where do we need resilience? And where do we need protection? We need a balance between the two. It's a lot of wasted money in just pure protection. So if we just balance that together, we can achieve a clear development plan for the future for that community. Interesting model and very effective. That's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Now I'm going to take some time for some questions, and because we are about 20 minutes or so, I thought the first thing we should do is see if anyone in the audience wanted to ask a question. Is there a microphone or, oh, we got one right there. Maybe you want to just stand up and introduce yourself and
computer management, essentially, which is far removed from the community. So you have this centralized system, and which is totally divorced from the kind of community you were talking about. And in fact, there's this interesting book by a Chinese general. He says, "I would never send the army to North America. I just take up the infrastructure through cyber attacks." So how would you address the dichotomy between the way the infrastructure is operated and managed and the community issue?
That's a very good question, and really this comes back to the idea of our take-up of technology and how we've layered vulnerabilities. With each vulnerability that we have accepted, our understanding of our dependencies has been reduced. And that's why if we understand the relationships within the infrastructure, we can understand, therefore, how, for example, water and electricity and fuel are interrelated. The influences on those dependencies are not reflected by the control mechanisms, because the control mechanisms are typically done on a traditional model which is utility specific or network specific. So your control system just looks at for example, a gas pipeline in isolation. It doesn't look at its wider relationship. What we need to be able to do, and we're in a position where we can do it if people want to do it, we need to understand those interdependencies between networks and with the communities. Because then we will know how to apply SCADA most efficiently or effectively. In a couple of cases that we've looked at, it has actually made more sense to go back to a DCS system, distributed control system, instead of SCADA, because the ability to respond required somebody who understood the network in that area. And so having teams of engineers within a DCS control center was a more cost-efficient, life cycle terms, more cost-efficient solution than having a SCADA system controlled remotely. So I would suggest, my answer to you is it's fundamental to that understanding of the infrastructure systems, how they relate to each other, and the community.
Hi, Jeff Ranson, Toronto 2030 District. I'm curious about the insurance sector and what they're doing to integrate themselves into the planning process in terms of how protocols are being developed and commenting on that from a growth plan.
That's a very good question, and I think one of the things, one of the things that we've excelled at ICLR is getting the insurance industry at the table with government, particularly local government. And very often what we found is when we do get insurers around the same table as municipal water people or planners or whatever, the first thing we hear is, hey, never really thought of that before. That's a good idea. And we start seeing those walls break down. I mean, municipal governments and insurers are kind of mortal enemies. They have been in the past. But when they do sit around the same table, they realize they have the same issues. Your homeowner, voter, taxpayer, whatever you want to call them, with a flooded basement is my insured. We have a common issue here. Let's talk about it. So unfortunately, that kind of thing is at its infancy, but it is growing, and we're trying to facilitate it for one. I mean, we've been talking over the last few months about coming up with a kind of a permanent group of municipalities and insurers and researchers that can sit around the same table, talk about the same issues, and come to some common solutions. In a bigger picture sense, groups like the Insurance Bureau of Canada is doing a really good job with government relations, dealing increasingly more with local governments, very good on the federal side, very good on the provincial side. They're getting more into talking with municipalities as well, and we're kind of making some headway in that regard too. But I think the big thing is just finding commonality and working together and not being adversaries anymore.
Any others from the audience? Oh, one at the back.
Hi, I'm Donna Dyken with the Ontario Growth Secretariat, and I'm interested in the costs of infrastructure. We know that there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be renewed, and costs are much higher now than when a lot of the infrastructure was put in the 50 years ago, for many reasons. And everyone is looking at models of doing things in more efficient ways. I'm wondering if anyone has looked at, on the panel, this idea of community-based responses, and if there is any work that's being done to look at costs of more local solutions rather than larger community solutions.
Well, I can jump in on one aspect of that. The immediate answer to your question is no. But what I would add is that infrastructure is not an immediate solution. Infrastructure is more of a statement about what our future capability will be. And so if we argue about what kind of transit system is going to be implemented, or where we should invest our money in the next infrastructure upgrade, we're actually missing the point. We need to be able to say, what is it that we want to be capable of in 25 years' time? It's going to take us 5 or 10 years to build the infrastructure in question. It then is going to affect its context, it's going to affect the communities, the dynamic will change. What is that dynamic that we are aspiring to? So to say, oh, invest in this infrastructure now, without having identified what you want that infrastructure to do, seems a little asinine, if not a waste of money.
This may not be either here nor there, but just a short comment in that we have to stop looking at infrastructure as a way to get people back to work. Look at it for the purpose, for the reason it's supposed to be there. It's just my short editorial.
Hi, it's Sandra Lester from Affecting Change. I do green building strategy. Glenn, you mentioned that architects are going to need to incorporate climate change risk into, and engineers as well, into their building design. What are the next steps in making that happen?
I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, as I said, there is a discussion, very early discussion going on out there about kind of, as I said, holding professionals to task for their failures, for lack of a better word. And we've been talking to engineer groups based on that, and they are themselves thinking about this idea of helping to drive that along by using the stick and saying, we're going to increasingly be held liable, professionally liable, for not incorporating climate change into our calculations, into our work. One of the answers might be getting the very few companies that insure professionals on side with this and talking to them about it. They can start driving some changes on their side. It's pretty amazing what can happen when you threaten an increase in insurance premium or threaten to pull insurance coverage away. People start taking some pretty quick actions when that sort of thing happens. And I find that some groups are way ahead of the curve, and of course, like anything else, and some are far behind. Engineers are in a different place along the continuum right now. Architects, some of them are in a different place. Urban planners are in a sometimes wholly different place altogether. And I'm not going to say where on the continuum because I'm going to get myself into trouble, but I would just have to get everybody on side with these ideas, I suppose. And that's pretty weak answer, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
James, did you have any take on that?
Well, I guess one thing I would say from the research side in urban climates is there are interests in how do we model the impact of green technologies, both at the building scale and as they accrue to a city. And so, what's the answer to the best choice of some combination of technology? That's being worked on, and it depends who you're looking at in terms of the building owner, or if it's the global commons. So it's tricky, and the technology's changing, so the answer changes too. So for example, urban climate models were quite good at testing white roofs. And that doesn't mean white roofs are necessarily the best answer, it's just that we had a tool that tested those. Testing green roofs is much more difficult because of the multiple benefits. It's also more difficult to assess their benefits, I think, because of the multiple benefits. And now you've got, as an example, do I put solar panels on my roof or do I paint it white? Or do I put solar panels on a green roof? And these are the sorts of questions that some of the modeling groups are starting to build in. So to look at what kind of benefits do those have either at the building scale or how do they feed back to the urban atmosphere? So it's interesting for us.
I'd like to rephrase that question, and that is that, what you were saying, that the municipalities really don't have that much of an incentive, plus they don't have the money, because the only thing they care about is flooding of the basement. If you then look at the private industry, what kind of an incentive the private industry, say to have, for example, a building emergency management program in place, which would kind of take care of some of these issues or would stimulate a development of some of these measures. What kind of a carrot do you have for the private industry to put these emergency management programs in place? Do they get some break on a premium, or are there any kind of carrots the insurance industry can give to the private industry?
Oh, absolutely, and it's happening now, and it's been happening for decades. I think everybody out there thinks that the insurance industry's role is to pay a claim and shut up. But that's just a small part of what they do. What they do is incentivize good risk-taking behavior and disincentivize bad risk-taking behavior. And they do that through the price, and they do that through the conditions of the contract, and they do that through the deductible. And sometimes they do that by walking away or threatening to walk away from a risk, a geographic area, a whole line of business. But it's happening all the time. And we do it, by saying, you'll get a break on your premium. Unfortunately, if we gave out those premium breaks as much as people think we should, the insurance product would be free. But we do these things, and we'll say to a business, if you have a good, strong business continuity plan in place, we'll look at your premium. If you have, a good hot site to go to after, an event, we'll look at your premium. If you don't do any of these things, you're going to pay more, or you might have a problem altogether getting coverage. And, as robust and big and healthy as our industry is in Canada, we have blips here and there, and one of the big blips lately has been getting commercial flood insurance in southern Alberta. Last I heard, it was almost impossible to get. It was very expensive. But it is happening. It has been happening for a long time. It will continue to happen going forward. We have some challenges, though. How do you incentivize a homeowner or small business to put in basement flood mitigation when all you can offer them is a discount on the sewer backup portion of the premium? You don't get a discount on your entire homeowner premium if you mitigate sewer backup. You only get a discount for the sewer backup portion, which would work out to be $10 a year. How do I incentivize you to put in $4,000 or $5,000 worth of mitigation, save you $10 a year on your premium? Woohoo, it doesn't work. And that's where insurers have to work with municipalities. We have to tap into some of the programs that municipalities have in place to incentivize, putting in a backwater valve, putting in a sump pump, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes the insurance industry can do it alone. Sometimes they have to work with others like municipal governments, provincial governments, but it is happening.
Hello there, Taki Eliadis from Sustainable Buildings Canada. There was a comment made earlier about, well, we can't rely on infrastructure to put people back to work, which I think is a fair comment. But it does raise the issue of the labor pool. And in the context of that graph with the recovery times, and I think there's a statistic about gone from 2 weeks of recovery down to a matter of hours for business. What about the risk of the headroom or capacity of the labor pool to respond? Is there a layer of research or some projections of the availability of massive labor to respond to these large-scale types of environmental events?
The people who react and respond are not the spare labor pool. They're the people already in the organizations, they're already in the municipalities. They are the staff within a business who have sufficient understanding and have hopefully even had a rehearsal of some kind in how they're going to keep that business afloat. It's not a separate labor pool. During a recovery, things slow down and you can start bringing on extra people. But if, for example, you're trying to respond to a flood or whatever else and get back into production, 2 o'clock in the morning, you're not employing extra people. They're different orders of magnitude, they're different scales. If you're looking at a regional recovery plan, you're absolutely right. The labor pool does come into effect, and that is something that the Mowat Centre, for example, we're looking at.
You make a good point. I'm not aware of any work that's been done in the area, but I can say that we do have the potential to be overwhelmed by events in Canada. Last year was a really good example, as I mentioned. The insurance industry in Canada was not only dealing with the floods in southern Alberta last year and the floods in Toronto, they were also dealing with the lac mégantic problem as well. So there's a finite number of companies and a finite a labor pool that goes in after the events and cleans up on behalf of the insurance industry. These are the catastrophe restoration companies. And I can tell you they were stretched to the absolute maximum last year. And at one point there was a rainstorm bearing down on Hamilton, Ontario, and one guy in that industry said, we are looking at that and we're crossing our fingers because if Hamilton gets whacked again with yet another major basement flood event, we just don't have the folks. They're in Alberta, they're in Toronto, and they're in Quebec. And so we do have that potential, and we can't kid ourselves to think that we don't have that potential. And I mean, when that big quake hits on the West Coast, and I do say when, not if, it's going to test and stress a whole lot of systems that we really don't have a really good understanding. Just as an aside, I found it quite interesting that I've heard that folks in Toronto have very little patience, and folks in Calgary have a lot of patience. And so when they were recovering after the flood event, if they were told it was going to take some time, they were okay with that. If they were told that they're not going to be able to see some tradesmen for a few weeks, they appeared to be okay with that, whereas folks in Toronto wanted them in there now. They wanted them there yesterday. So the changes from place to place. But I can also say that catastrophe models used by catastrophe modeling firms, and the insurance industry uses them, they do include a factor in there called demand surge. And so we do know that after a very large event, there is demand surge. The cost of labor goes up and the cost of building materials goes up. And we don't have a good understanding of it yet, but it was a big problem in Slave Lake, Alberta, where you have a town of 13,000 and all of a sudden you need thousands of tradesmen from all over the place flowing in there to do the work. Where do you put these folks? Where do they stay during this multi-year recovery process? And can you get your hands on building materials and that sort of thing? Basically, barely got off the end of that event when the southern Alberta floods happened, much greater degree, and of course stressed that the construction and trades industry again. So we do have that potential to be overwhelmed, and I don't think we have a really good understanding of it. We need that understanding.
We have a couple minutes left, so maybe just take one more question right here at the front.
Peter Love, Summerhill. We love your comment about confidence in leadership and whether the leadership is there or not, and then I just compare that to the situations when you're saying difference between Calgary and Toronto, and I think there was a huge amount of confidence in the leadership in Calgary, and just a total lack of that in Toronto. And I think that could be why, would be one of the reasons why you saw Toronto reacting differently to a crisis than people in Calgary, because they knew they would pull through, and Toronto, I think, was we got leaderless for a while, so or what we had for a leader didn't really count. So I really like that idea of confidence in leadership, and I think it's really critical. So good points.
Okay, well, I think that brings us up to right around the end of the session. I mean, for me, I think it was great to see the 3 presentations pulled together. The climate's changing. It's going to continue to change. It's costing us through higher insurance premiums and taxes eventually. And we have to think of ourselves as a community when dealing with resilience. So I think it's a great message to start off the conference today. So with that, just thanks to the panelists.
Well, thanks everyone for your insights. Thank you to Intact Insurance for sponsoring this, and to Jason for doing such a great job of keeping you exactly on time. I just wanted to sort of make a quick comment on the trade issue, because I did have that experience a couple of years ago working with a hot water tank rental company and experiencing the requirement to replace about 1,000 water heaters in Hamilton immediately following the floods that they had there. And the issues we had in trying to get enough people to deal with it. Hot water is a public health issue, and getting those replaced quickly was definitely an issue. I'd like to recognize and thank our break sponsors next. We're going to take about 15 minutes for a quick bio break and to allow everyone to grab a coffee. So thank you to Arborist Consulting. Please grab a refreshment and be back in your seats for 10:30. Thank you.